Nestled in the mountains of West Virginia lies a cemetery where the headstones tell a story that defies nature itself. But the true horror isn't carved in stone, it's what they deliberately left out. The dates don't add up. The names repeat in impossible ways. And if you follow the family lines on that weathered stone, you'll uncover something designed to make your blood run cold. This is more than just a tale of inbreeding. It's more than a story of isolation. This is about a woman who became pregnant by her own grandson, and the twisted bloodline that forged one of America's most disturbing family secrets. A secret so dark, it was erased from history. Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. What I'm about to share was buried for over a century. The records were hidden, the witnesses were silenced. But what I found in a dusty courthouse basement changes everything. And once you hear this story, you'll understand why some secrets were meant to stay hidden. Her name was Betty, and she lived in the hollow, a place where the sun barely touched the ground. But the darkness there wasn't from the lack of sun, it was in the blood. Families had intermarried for so long that children were born with ancient-looking faces and eyes that seemed to know things they shouldn't. But Betty's story goes much deeper than that. What I'm about to tell you goes far beyond any genetic damage. The year was 1887, and the mountains of West Virginia were a world unto themselves. No roads led in or out of Cane Creek Hollow. No strangers ever came to call. The families there had been isolated for nearly a century, and their bloodlines had become a puzzle where every piece was the wrong shape. Betty was born into this world with a curse already written in her bones. Her parents were first cousins, her grandparents were siblings, but what I found about her great-grandparents was too dark even for the family Bible. By her first breath, she carried the genetic burden of 5 generations. But that was just the beginning. Because here's what the historians won't tell you. What they buried in those courthouse records. Betty wasn't just a victim of this twisted family tree, she became its architect. As she grew, something inside her broke. And what happened next can't be explained by genetics alone. It was as if the mountains themselves had poisoned her soul. The first signs appeared at 14. Other children whispered about how Betty's eyes would follow her male relatives in ways that made their skin crawl. How she would stand too close, touch for too long. The old women knew, but they feared that speaking of it would only invite more darkness. By 16, she had given birth to her first child. The father was her uncle. But that was just the beginning of a story that would make even the most hardened investigators question everything. The hollow had its own twisted logic. But what happened next defied all comprehension. Betty's first child, a boy named Samuel, was born with the telltale signs of severe inbreeding. His eyes were too close together, his skull misshapen, his fingers webbed like some ancient curse-made flesh. But Betty looked at that child, and saw something else entirely. She saw opportunity. A continuation of a bloodline so pure in its corruption, it had transcended humanity itself. And as Samuel grew, Betty began to groom him for a role that no child should ever be prepared for. The isolation worked in her favor. No schools, no churches, no one to question what happened behind the walls of that ramshackle cabin. Betty became Samuel's entire world, teaching him that the love between family members knew no boundaries. That their devotion was pure. By the time Samuel was 12, the other families noticed. Betty had become possessive in ways that made even the hardened mountain folk uncomfortable. She kept him close, whispering secrets in his ear that turned his young face pale with understanding. The old-timers told of strange sounds from Betty's cabin late at night. Sounds that weren't quite crying and weren't quite singing, but something in between that made the hair on your arms stand up. They saw how Samuel's eyes began to take on the same predatory gleam as his mother's. He stopped looking at other people altogether. But what happened when Samuel turned 15 would be documented in a journal, hidden away for decades, waiting to be found. Discovered in 1962 during the cabin's demolition, the entries were in Betty's own hand. They reveal a mind that had descended so far into madness she believed she was performing a sacred ritual. She wrote of ceremonies under the full moon, reciting names of ancestors. She wrote of her duty. But most disturbing of all, she wrote about Samuel as if he weren't her son, but her destiny. The neighbors saw Samuel change. His voice dropped, his shoulders broadened, but his mind regressed. He spoke in fragments, half-sentences like prayers. He walked the property at dawn and dusk in ritual patterns. And always, Betty watched him with a hunger that went beyond a mother's love. The inevitable happened on a winter night in 1904. Samuel was 17. Betty was 33. The journal entry from that night is written in a shaking hand, but the words are clear enough to freeze your blood. Betty wrote about completing the circle. Achieving God's intended perfection. She wrote how Samuel came to her not as a son, but as a culmination. And 9 months later, Betty gave birth to a daughter. A daughter who was simultaneously Samuel's child and his sister. Betty's grandchild and her own daughter. The family tree wasn't just twisted, it was a knot that defied every law of nature. The child was named Sarah. And from her first breath, it was clear something fundamental had broken. Her features were so distorted the midwife crossed herself and prayed. Her skull was malformed, her limbs twisted. Her eyes held a vacancy, a soul damaged beyond repair. But Betty looked at this broken child and saw triumph. In her warped mind, Sarah was the ultimate achievement. A being whose genetic heritage was so concentrated, she embodied generations of corruption in a single form. Betty wrote that Sarah was the perfect vessel. The key to unlocking the final mystery. If you're still watching, you're braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done. The other families began to avoid Betty's cabin entirely. They took longer routes. Forbade their children from going near the creek. Those who glimpsed Sarah whispered of a child who didn't seem human, whose cries sounded like a wounded animal. Samuel had become unrecognizable. The trauma and genetic damage left him in permanent mental regression. He'd spend hours on the porch, rocking, staring at nothing, mumbling words that might have been names or just nonsense. But Betty wasn't finished. As Sarah grew, Betty spoke of her plans for the child's future. How Sarah would give birth to even more perfect children. And when people asked who the father would be, Betty's smile would take on that same predatory gleam. By Sarah's 5th birthday, the true horror was revealed. The child could barely walk. Her speech was incomprehensible. She swung between catatonia and violent outbursts. But to Betty's fractured mind, this wasn't catastrophe, it was transcendence. Her journal entries descended into pure madness. She wrote of visions from ancestors, who told her Sarah was the chosen vessel. She described rituals, covering the child in symbols of ash and blood, whispering incantations in a strange, twisted language. The other families had reached their breaking point. Led by the patriarch, Ezekiel, a man who'd seen enough darkness for lifetimes, they gathered to discuss the Betty problem. These were not people who scared easily. But this had crossed a line. Their decision was brutal and final. They would give Betty one last chance to leave the hollow voluntarily. If she refused, they would take matters into their own hands. Ezekiel delivered the threat on a morning fog so thick you couldn't see your feet. Betty's response was to laugh. Not the laugh of madness, but of someone who believed she held all the power. She told him her family was protected by forces he couldn't understand. That Sarah's destiny was written in blood and starlight. And that anyone who interfered would face consequences echoing through generations. What happened next depends on who you ask, but the cemetery stones don't lie. On the night of November 15, 1909, a fire consumed Betty's cabin as she, Samuel, and Sarah slept. Officially, an overturned lantern. But the bodies were found huddled in the center of the room, as if waiting, not escaping. Ezekiel's grandson, before his death in 1987, claimed his grandfather confessed the truth. The fire was no accident. The men of the Hollow decided some bloodlines were too corrupted to continue. They surrounded the cabin and set it ablaze, standing guard to ensure no one escaped. But here's where the story takes its final, most horrifying turn. A turn that proves the nightmare was far from over. When clearing the ruins 3 days later, they found something that shouldn't have existed. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a wooden box. Inside were dozens of carefully preserved samples, hair, teeth, biological materials from every member of the bloodline for 5 generations. And beside them, a detailed breeding chart. It mapped not just the past, but the future. It showed Sarah's projected offspring, calculated with mathematical precision for what Betty called the ultimate convergence. But most chilling of all, it showed Betty's name at the center of a web connecting her to every family member. Her relationship with Samuel was just the beginning. The box was buried in an unmarked grave, and the men swore an oath never to speak of it. But secrets have a way of surviving. And somewhere in those West Virginia mountains, in a cemetery where the headstones whisper a twisted story, Betty's legacy continues to speak its dark truths to anyone brave enough to listen. The bloodline ended in fire in 1909, but the questions it raises about the depths of human depravity remain. Some boundaries, once crossed, can never, ever be uncrossed. The silence that fell over Cane Creek Hollow after the fire was heavier than any fog. For decades, the story was a ghost, a shameful whisper that parents used to scare disobedient children. Behave, or the Betty folk will get you. But the oath held. The secret of the box, with its gruesome trophies and terrifying blueprint, stayed buried. That is, until a hiker stumbled upon a rusted lockbox washed out by a landslide in the spring of 1998. He was a geology student from Morgantown, mapping rock formations, and thought he'd found a miner's old strongbox. He pried it open, expecting dust and rust. Instead, he found papers. Preserved by the tin and the cold mountain air, the pages were brittle but legible. It was Ezekiel's journal. The one he swore he'd never keep. The entry started with the fire, detailing the grim decision and the grimmer deed. But it was the final entry, dated the morning after the burial of the box, that contained the true hook, the detail that changes the entire story. We buried the evil last night, down in the wet earth where no sun shines. But as we turned to leave, Jeremiah pointed back at the fresh-turned soil. There, plain as day, was a single set of footprints leading away from the grave. Small footprints. A child's. We searched the woods till dawn, calling out. But we found nothing. The hollow has not been cleansed. It has been seeded. And now we must live with what we have unleashed. The hiker took the journal to the County Historical Society. The old woman who ran it, a lifelong resident with deep roots in the area, turned pale as she read. She confirmed the story of the fire, the family. But she said the darkest part was always the aftermath. The children born in the years after, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Some of them had that look. Not all. Just a few, here and there. The same close-set eyes. The same way of staring that made you feel cold. Folks said it was just the old bloodlines, popping up again. But my grandmother, she swore on her Bible that the night of the fire, she saw a little figure, no higher than her knee, watching from the tree line. She said it wasn't crying. It was smiling. The story doesn't end with a fire. It explodes outward from it. The systematic plan in Betty's chart wasn't for her immediate family alone. The journal and the whispers suggest a horrifying possibility, that the ultimate convergence wasn't just about Sarah's children. It was about spreading that concentrated, corrupted bloodline back into the community she was ostracized from. A perverse form of revenge, generations in the making. The isolated hollows of West Virginia hold their secrets close. Families intermarried for another 50 years after Betty. The bloodlines were already tangled. How easy would it have been for a single, new thread of profound corruption to weave itself back into the fabric, unnoticed? Today, if you drive through those winding mountain roads, you might stop in a small town diner. And you might see a family eating lunch. A mother, a father, a child. And if you catch that child's eye, you might see a flicker of something ancient, something knowing. Something that doesn't belong in a child's face. You'll tell yourself it's a trick of the light. A coincidence. But the headstones in that lonely cemetery tell a different story. And so do the small, unexplained footprints sometimes found in the mud after a hard rain, circling the perimeter of an unmarked grave, as if something, or someone, is still waiting for its inheritance. The bloodline didn't end. It simply went to ground. And it's waiting.